All rise, veuillez vous lever. Please be seated, veuillez vous asseoir.
Standing up, Mr. Nichols, for a purpose, or
Yes, Your Honor. Just to say that Mr. Khan, the prosecutor, has had to leave the courtroom. But we are joined by Alison Whitford.
yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Nichols. Yes. Right, Miss Sims, you were going to carry on, I think.
Yes, Your Honours. Just to indicate, at the time we took the break, I was just going on to deal with the context of the attack. In relation to the evidence which the prosecution will adduce, in particular from witnesses 7, 29, 932, 986, and other witnesses, the chamber will hear from them that the members of the militia Janjaweed and GOS forces, that they were well armed. They came into the areas on land cruisers which had dushkas atop them, and some of the attackers had Kalashnikovs, bladed weapons, and witness 986 in particular will speak about some of the attackers carrying fire sticks. The issue of rebel presence, Your Honours, is an important context to the attack, because several of the witnesses will explain to the chamber that at the time they lived there, prior to and during the attack, they were not aware of any rebel presence. In particular, the chamber will hear from witness 15, who will describe that the first time she heard the term Tora Bora, which was the words used by members of the militia Janjaweed and their associates, was really from that community, which is used to describe rebels at the point when she was accused of being the wives of rebels. There are witnesses, such as witness 12, who the court will hear from, the chamber will hear from him, indicating that he would have assisted in burying a number of the bodies, and from his observation, he will explain that he determined that none of the deceased victims were fighters, as they were not wearing any military clothing, and he did not find any weapons on their persons. When we look at the nature of the violence, the prosecution will lead evidence that it was extreme. There is one insider witness who will explain from his vantage point in Kudum that the violence was so extreme that he was led to observe, and I quote him directly, that the revenge of Ali Kushayb and his comrades against the village of Kudum was immense. They were trying to beat one another to getting to the village, pillaging and burning it to appease their anger. The prosecution will further adduce evidence relating to some of the deceased victims, which will establish that at the time they were murdered, some of them were completely defenseless or were in fact running away from the attackers. I invite the chamber to look again at the screen, and here we have a list of 63 civilians who were murdered. I pause to observe to the chamber that the prosecution will also be leading evidence relating to the murder of unidentified victims, some of whom were buried together in single graves. One of the first victims, Your Honors, is Mr. Issa Ahmad. And we will hear from witness 29 that this person was shot in his head and chest in his presence. And there are 3 victims that we will speak to now, and these are Ms. Koni Harun and Ms. Hussein. Witness 7 will describe to the court that in the first wave of the attack on Bindisi, that these women were raped by members of the militia Janjaweed or GOS forces and killed. There is also a 3rd victim listed there, Miss Halima Issa. And here again, Your Honors, witness 7 will describe that the witness was killed as she was fending off the attackers who were making attempts on her person. The other victim that we will speak to is Mr. Mohammed Kamis, and several of the witnesses will give evidence that they saw the body of the deceased, and there is one witness in particular, witness 12, who was present at the time that Mr. Mohammed Kamis was killed. And this victim, Your Honors, is universally identified as the town's tailor. The other victim, Mr. Mudassir Ibrahim Garat, the circumstances of his murder highlights the motion of the attack, as witness 868 will describe to the chamber that this victim was shot in his back as he was running away from the attackers. I had spoken earlier about the importance of the Wadi Saleh River in Bindisi, and here again we'll hear from witness 11, who will describe making attempts with members of her family to flee across the river, and one member of the family was shot in his chest as he turned to see if others were following behind him. There's also witness 589. Again, this witness will speak of the murder of Mr. Abu Issa, and this victim, Your Honor, was also shot in the back as he was making attempts to flee. The prosecution has particularized count 3, which is murders committed in the context of the violation of Common Article 3. And in relation to this count, Your Honors, there are 3 witnesses that the prosecution, the circumstances of their murder, the prosecution will speak to. And this is Mr. Adam Bosch, Mr. Rashid Issa, and Mr. Nasir. The prosecution will lead evidence that for 2 of these men, Mr. Bosch and Mr. Issa, that they were restrained, they were placed forward on the ground, and they were shot to death. With this witness identifies that the attackers used a Kalashnikov. The other victim, Your Honor, Mr. Nasir, somehow evaded the exchange of bullets, the firing, and they determined to kill him by beating him. This witness 11 will speak to the circumstances under which he was beaten to death. In relation to outrages, other inhumane acts and outrages upon the personal dignity, the prosecution will adduce evidence from victims as it relates to the degrading and humiliating treatment that they encountered. The prosecutor earlier today spoke about the circumstances of one of the victims who would have narrated seeing women being stripped of their clothing. I won't repeat that evidence, Your Honor, but just to indicate to the chamber that we will lead evidence in terms of statements made to some of these women while they were being violated, such as the pre-selection of some of the women and girls, and the attackers saying to them essentially, we will take the beautiful ones as wives, and the ugly ones will be servants to our wives. The witnesses will also speak about men who were detained and how the attackers called them by various names, such as Abid, as explained earlier, meaning slave, Kadim, which is in English servant, and speaking to them using the term Nuba. One witness, Your Honor, will further explain that they were told by the attackers that they were sent to kill every black thing except the laloba and the labe trees, which are also black. The additional evidence to come in relation to this incident, Your Honor, will show that the victims were told that they were of no benefit and that the attackers had gotten the permission to wipe us out, to kill us, to chase us away. So here we're seeing the attackers essentially mirroring words earlier spoken by the accused as he gave orders for the attack to begin, the sweep away, the wipe away. In relation to the acts of rape, there is a context which the prosecution will adduce in its evidence as it relates to the sexual violence. There's one insider witness, 921, who will explain to the chamber that he observed about 50 women who had fled to the village of Mukjar. And he observed that some of these women were either naked or they were wearing torn clothing. The further evidence to come, Your Honors, is that there were a group of militia Janjaweed leaders in Bindisi, and the accused would have been in that area. However, this witness speaks about one of the militia leaders, along with other attackers, boasting about the women that they had raped in Bindisi. I again invite the chamber to look at an excerpt from a witness statement. This is witness 15. And this witness, Your Honor, narrates the violence that was meted out to victims of the militia Janjaweed or GOS forces. And if we look at the statement, Your Honors, we will see this witness saying that some of the women, in order for them to be silenced, that their mouths were stuffed with their own clothing. And this witness will further narrate, describe that as they raped some of the women, the reaction of members of the militia Janjaweed and GOS forces was to celebrate by saying, "We have taken Tora Bora wives." This witness, Your Honor, will also indicate that at points when women who were raped bled, the attackers would fire in the air and shout, I have found a virgin woman," celebrating the violation of these women. As I move the chamber forward in relation to the issue of pillaging, Your Honors, and destruction of property, the prosecution will adduce evidence from several witnesses establishing the pattern of the attack, the focus on pillaging, the collecting of livestock, taking items from the homes, and the systematic destruction of the Zakat building, the houses, the mosque, and other buildings of importance within their community. Specific to the pillaging, the prosecution will adduce evidence relating to the conduct of the accused in Kudum, that he gave instructions to members of the militia Janjaweed and GOS forces to take away items belonging to a member of the Kudum community, and the attackers complied, immediately went and took away the items. The other evidence to come, Your Honors, is the specific targeting of property belonging to members of the 4 community. And here we'll have the evidence of witness 12, who will explain to the chamber that what he saw was that there were some areas in the shop that had a special marking, and that throughout the pillaging and destruction of the area, these shops were left untouched. However, in relation to the other areas, the militia Janjaweed and GOS forces pillaged the areas of their content, such as sugar and other items. The effect of this complete violence, Your Honor, the widespread, the systematic violence within these communities ultimately forced the civilian population in Kudum and Bindisi to seek safe shelter in Mukjar. The prosecution will bring both documentary and testimonial evidence to establish the size of the population affected and the number of persons who were essentially left homeless, landless as a result of the violence. In relation to the counts relating to persecution, my colleague, Mr. Sachithanandan, will outline the evidence that the prosecution will lead in relation to this. I now turn, Your Honors, to the final scheme of evidence that the prosecution will adduce in relation to the accused. And this relates to his criminal responsibility for the crimes committed in Kudum, Bindisi, and the surrounding areas on about the 15th and 16th of August 2003. Again, I invite the chamber to have a look at the screen. And here, Your Honors, the associations of the accused is depicted. And here we're seeing the accused at the pyramid of this relationship. And below, there is Hasabala, who is a PDF officer, Same, who is also is a member of the militia Janjaweed, and Banjus, who is also a militia leader. Earlier, Your Honors, my colleague, Mr. Jeremy, had focused on a particular statement which was made by the accused in Mukjar. And his statement was, Your Honor, is, I know that the rebels comes from inside the towns, so I'm going there and hitting hard everybody. I don't care if it's elderly or kids or anyone. The context of this statement attributed to the accused, Your Honors, was the intervention of persons in the meeting, essentially saying, we do not believe it is appropriate to target women, children, and the elderly. That was the response of the accused. The further evidence that the prosecution will adduce in terms of the accused authority was his ability to move the attackers from one village to the other through the orders that he gave to Same. And the evidence will show that Same complied with the order. And in 874's testimony, the chamber will hear that Same identified the accused as a general commander and that he, Same, was an assistant to the accused. We'll also lead evidence, Your Honor, in relation to Hasabala, a PDF officer who is not a part of the militia Janjaweed. However, on the day, the accused had the authority to give him instructions in terms of moving from village to village. I now turn specifically to deal with the conduct of the accused. And the evidence, Your Honors, that will be adduced will show that the accused was actively directing attackers throughout the incident, as well as giving them orders. Again, the prosecution will lead evidence that persons present sought to intervene to stay the intensity or level of the violence, yet the accused is quoted as saying, and this is in relation to the intervener saying, the level of this violence will not please Allah. Stop. The response of the accused, Your Honor, as this witness will explain, is that this is our work. Don't teach us how to do it. If you don't like our work, go ahead, ask for one of the horses in front of you, get on it, and leave. Or just leave us alone. This command to others who disagreed with him, Your Honors, is also reflected in the evidence to come from witness 874, who also intervened based on the level of the violence. And again, the accused response was, if you do not agree with what is happening here, go, leave. The prosecution will demonstrate that so established was the accused's authority on the ground that his command to this witness to leave was reinforced by others who also joined in telling this witness to leave. Your Honors, finally, the prosecution on the evidence that we will adduce for the Kudum, Bindisi, and surrounding areas charges will establish that the accused is guilty for the act of attacking the civilian population, the murder, pillaging, destruction of property, the other inhumane acts, the outrages upon personal dignity, the rape, forcible transfer, and persecution. If it pleases you, Your Honors, I thank the Chamber for its time.
Yes, thank you very much, Miss Sims. Who's going next? Yes.
It's me, Your Honor.
All right, Mr. Scratch.
If you just give me 30 seconds to switch over.
I'll do that. Yeah.
Your Honor, as Prosecutor Khan mentioned, I'll be dealing with both mukja and persecution. Looking at the clock, I think I'll run to the end of mukja and probably stop there to make sure that we handle the rest of the housekeeping litigation today.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yes. And Your Honor, please let me know if you have trouble hearing me, and I'll definitely speak up. Usually the criticism is the opposite, but all right. Your Honors, as the evidence unfolds during the course of this trial, regarding the events that occurred in Mukja and its surrounding areas, between late February 2004 and March 2004, it will become clear that Mr. Abd-Al-Rahman had a common plan, shared a common plan with a group consisting of members of the Janjaweed and forces of the government of Sudan. So who were these members of the common plan? You will notice a familiar name, that is to say, Janjaweed leader Aldaif Sameh, since Ms. Sims already mentioned him in the context of Bindisi and Kudum, but he was indeed also an active participant in the common plan relating to Mukja. Additionally, there was military intelligence officer Hamdi, who was the head of military intelligence at the Garcilla military base. Not only will you hear of him from me regarding Mukja, but you will also hear of Mr. Hamdi in the context of Delege from Miss Whitford, sitting behind me, since he was also involved in that particular attack. And of course, finally, we have Mr. Abd-Al-Rahman, who was the central or key figure in this common plan, and indeed in all the charged crimes, having participated in Kudum, Bindizi, Mukja, and Delege. The fact that Samih participated in Kudum and Bindizi, and the fact that Hamdi also participated in Delege is an indicator of how the members of the Mukja Common Plan had a close cooperative relationship, a matter that Mr. Jeremy has mentioned already. So what indeed was this common plan? It was to target persons in Mukja, including those persons displaced to Mukja from locations in the surrounding areas, perceived as belonging to, associated with, or in some way supporting the rebel armed groups. And this targeting was meant to take place by means of torture, other inhumane acts, cruel treatment, outrages upon personal dignity, murder, and persecution. And that is precisely why those types of conduct, those charges, are reflected in the charges brought against Mr. Abd-Al-Rahman in the context of Mukja. So this, in essence, was the Mukja Common Plan. And the existence of the Common Plan is evident in the joint and coordinated nature of the actions of Mr. Abd-Al-Rahman and his co-perpetrators, as well as the statements made by the accused and his co-perpetrators at that time, that you will hear throughout the next few months. What exactly was the role of Mr. Abd-Al-Rahman in this plan? He made an essential contribution to the plan and the charged crimes by, firstly, ordering and carrying out arrests of 4 males in Mukja, and then detaining them at Mukja police station, verbally abusing the detainees at Mukja police station, including by threatening them with death, physically assaulting the detainees, taking the detainees into his custody, selecting detainees to be removed from Mukja, supervising the transport, then assaulting physically again the detainees at least one execution site, and then finally giving the order and prompting Janjaweed forces and the forces of the government of Sudan to shoot and kill the detainees. It is evidence regarding these actions and statements of Mr. Abd-Al-Rahman that the prosecution will lead in the coming months. And it is to that evidence that I turn to now. In February 2004, the accused carried out an armed operation in the area of Sindhu, as you can see in this image before you. During this operation, as the forces traveled northwest towards Sindhu, they attacked a number of villages that you will see identified here and surrounded by a black box. Hopefully, if this PowerPoint is working, as it is indeed. These villages included a number of villages that will be important for the Mukja case. The villages of Nearly, Abirla, Korofata, Tindi, Arada, and a number of other villages in the vicinity of Mukja. As these attacks took place, hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians in these villages were forced to flee and head towards Mukja, as you can see in this image. This includes at least 7 prosecution witnesses whose evidence will be led before you, either orally or otherwise. And this, in turn, brings us to Mukja. You will see before you here a satellite image of Mukja with some key locations indicated. You can see, for example, the Mukja police station, as well as the road leading northwards towards Garsila, which again is crucial for this criminal episode, as well as a number of other relevant locations. Importantly, by the time these civilians were fleeing their attacked villages and coming to Mukja, the Janjaweed and Government of Sudan forces had set up a number of checkpoints. They were at least towards the north of Mukja and towards the east of Mukja, as evident in the image. Why were these checkpoints set up? We have one indication as to why. Witness 905 says that prior to departing from Mukja to Sindhu for the Sindhu attack, the accused had instructed the head of police of Mukja, I quote, "Any man coming down from Sindhu, he has to be kept, and if this does not happen, you will bear responsibility," end quote. And so, predictably, as the displaced people, principally 4 civilians, flooded into Mukja, the Janjaweed and Government of Sudan forces arrested hundreds of predominantly 4 males at locations including the checkpoints indicated in the map, as well as during house-to-house searches and elsewhere. Crucially, the Janjaweed and Government of Sudan forces perceived these displaced 4 males as belonging to or associated with or somehow supporting the rebel armed groups. Mr. Abd-Al-Rahman and his co-perpetrators were key actors in this arrest process. At least 3 witnesses will describe how Mr. Abd-Al-Rahman and Samih conducted arrests in Mukja. Witness P12, for example, states that, I quote, "Yahya Ahmed Zaruk, the brother of the Shahtai of Mukja, was arrested by Kushayb himself," end quote. Upon their arrest, at least 122 Fur males were taken to Mukja police station. You can see highlighted in this image, this location. And if we can zoom in somewhat, you will see 2 buildings, and these detainees were kept principally in the small northern building, which was at one point sketched by one of the detainees. You will see that his sketch, that is the sketch by witness 877, matches the structure in the satellite photo. And indeed, the witness has indicated where he himself was detained with many other detainees, as well as a number of other very small rooms where other detainees were kept. The detainees were civilians. Some were very old, some were very, very young, and overwhelmingly, again, males of the Fur ethnicity. They included at least 9 witnesses, 9 prosecution witnesses, whose evidence will be laid before you in the coming months. They also included the local Fur community leader that I mentioned earlier, Umda Yahya Ahmed Zaruk, who was the Umda of Mukja, about 62 years old, and indeed, he was accompanied in the prison by at least 8 other civilian Fur community leaders, including the Umda and head of the court of Mukja, Issa Harun Noor, who had been detained with other members of his family. Umda Noor had also been fleeing from one of the attacked villages and had been arrested when he arrived in Mukja. It also included another Fur community leader, Umda Adam Hussein Abdul Mahmoud. Your Honors, there's a reason I'm particularly mentioning these community leaders. It is because they were leaders of the Fur community, and therefore harm directed against them was, in a symbolic sense, harm directed against the Fur community. Targeting such Fur civilian leaders was, as mentioned by Prosecutor Khan, an explicit policy of the government of Sudan. And indeed, as mentioned by Mr. Jeremy, it is even contained in the official documentation of the government of Sudan, this policy. There were also present a wide variety of civilians from different walks of life. There was a doctor or medical assistant, again a relative of Umda Zaruk. There were police officers such as Abdulaziz El-Kas. There was Adam Nahid Numan, who was a guard of the Shakhtai of Mukja. Again, every single person a Fur man. And indeed, Adam Nahid was fleeing the village of Tindi since it was attacked by Mr. Abd-Al-Rahman's forces, which is why he was in Mukja when he was arrested by Mr. Abd-Al-Rahman's forces. There were also farmers and traders, such as Hassan Abdallah, who was arrested with members of his family, as well as Yahya Sharaf al-Din Abdallah, who too was detained with other members of his family. There were also students, such as Abdul Khalik Yahya Ishaq Musa, of whom much will be said later, as well as Abdul Karim Abd-Al-Rahman Muhammad, who was another student from Tindi. Finally, there were even a few orphan boys between the ages of 9 and 12 who had been studying the Quran at a khalwa or Quranic school nearby with an elderly sheikh, and who had also been arrested by the police. So, Your Honors, as you can see, a broad variety of detainees, all male, all overwhelmingly of the Fur ethnicity, kept in Mukja police station, which is where their suffering truly began. Over the next few days, the large group of detainees were detained in rooms so crowded that there was no access to toilets. Detainees were forced to urinate and defecate where they squatted. Some were given dirty water to drink and a stale loaf of bread to split between 10 prisoners, while others received nothing. Notably, some of the community leaders were also undressed, adding to their humiliation in the squalid, fetid conditions of the prison. Detainee witness P877 describes how in the middle of the night, a member of the Sudanese armed forces put his head inside the cell and told the detainees to pray, adding, I quote, "Not all of you will be alive tomorrow," end quote. While these 4 males were detained at the police station, short statements were taken from them. Abd-Al-Rahman reviewed a few of these statements, ripped them up, and threw them on the floor. Meanwhile, he was also conversing with Minister Harun regarding the influx of displaced Fur civilians. One witness saw Abd-Al-Rahman speaking on his satellite phone. The witness says, I quote, "I heard Harun tell Ali Kushayb that he had a free pass to do whatever he wanted. Al-Taib, that is to say, the head of the CRF in the Mukja police station, Al-Taib and Ali Kushayb then had an argument, during which Ali Kushayb told him he had permission to burn Mukja to the ground," end quote. Admittedly, this statement is general in nature and not necessarily about the detainees at the police station. But it is a useful window into the state of mind of Abd-Al-Rahman and his co-perpetrators at that time, about the 4 civilians arriving in Mukja, as well as the 4 civilians who were living in Mukja at that time. This very state of mind and the authorization from Harun to carry out crimes is also made clear by another account. Witness 129 describes how Abd-Al-Rahman, Janjaweed leader Sameh, and intelligence officer Hamdi entered the cell where he and other detainees were imprisoned. And Abd-Al-Rahman stated, I quote, "Don't you know that I am Ali Kushayb," end quote. The witness continues. Ali Kusheb said we were mahus, meaning people who do not have any beliefs. He said that Ahmad Harun had authorized them to confiscate the property of the four and eliminate the four. Similarly, witness 919 describes how, when he was detained, Ali Kusheb came into the cell with about 10 of his men. He introduced himself to the Umdas in the cell, that he was Ali Kusheb, the leader of the Janjaweed. He further said, I quote, I am going to fuck you today, end quote. At the same time, Samih told the detainees, I quote, you, Toroboro, we will finish you, end quote. Your Honors, these were not idle threats. This was a blunt promise of what was to come. Because at this point began a period of hell for the detainees. Janjaweed co-perpetrators, Samih, Hamdi, and Abd-Al-Rahman tortured the detainees using axes, knives, sticks, whips, and other weapons. Several witnesses describe how Abd-Al-Rahman personally attacked a number of community leaders with his axe. Witness 129 describes, for example, I saw him hit Umda Isa Harun on the head with an axe. The Umda fell flat. Umda Yahya and a child who was sitting next to Umda Yahya were also hit by the sharp end of Ali Kusheb's axe. Witness 990, yet another detainee witness, describes how he himself was assaulted. He says, I quote, Ali Kusheb swung the axe in an underarm motion, and it struck me near the inner calf muscle of my leg. P990 bears the scars of Abd-Al-Rahman's axe to this very day, as you can see in this image. I should mention at this point that Abd-Al-Rahman's axe is a recurring leitmotif throughout this case. In Mukja alone, you will hear 11 prosecution witnesses speak of the accused wielding this axe. And Ms. Whitford behind me will list an equal number, if not more, mentioning the same in Dilej. The absolute brutality of what Abd-Al-Rahman and his co-perpetrators were doing is highlighted by the mutilations they carried out. As witness P919 describes, and as was briefly mentioned by the prosecutor this morning, Kusheb was beating the Umdas at this time. 3 detainees had ears cut off, which fell on the ground. The Janjaweed did not say why they cut their ears. 3 of them did not receive any treatment. They were bleeding. There was a lot of blood. Detainee witness 919 describes other horrific events that he was subject to. He says that after Ali Kusheb had left the cell, the Abu Tayra, the Central Reserve Forces, brought in a clothes iron with which he was burned because the CRF wanted him to confess to being a rebel. He was not alone, and he saw many other detainees being burned at the same time. Similarly, other witnesses provide accounts of being burned by using melted plastic bottles on the skin of detainees. Coming back to witness 919, who was burned with the iron, almost 20 years later, today, he still carries on his body a vivid reminder of the agony that he suffered that day. You can see here images of both his leg and his arm. Your Honors, many other detainees carry less visible but equally painful scars from their experience, emotional scars. However, unlike these detainees who bear today either physical or emotional scars, most, if not the majority of detainees who were at Mukja police station will not be able to tell their story at trial. They will not have that opportunity because they did not survive their detention. and it is to their lives, or it is what happened to them, that I will discuss now. At this point, after these days of torture, together with his co-perpetrators, Abd-Al-Rahman played a key role in obtaining custody of the detainees into his hands. On the day of the executions, there was a meeting in the yard of the police station featuring Abd-Al-Rahman, Hamdi, Samih, and others, and detainee 129, peering through the bars of his detention cell, saw this and thought that they must have taken a decision at this meeting, because immediately after the meeting, the co-perpetrators came right over to the detention cell to open the doors and start taking persons out. Witness P905, a witness with a different vantage point, makes it clear how Abd-Al-Rahman obtained custody. He says that Abd-Al-Rahman stated to the head of police in Mukja, I quote, "These people, we want to take them to Garcilla, and then we take them to Zelengi to investigate with them, because they're all accused, they're all suspects," end quote. Abd-Al-Rahman ordered a police officer to open the doors in the presence of the head of police and other government of Sudan leadership, and ordered, I quote, "All these are no good. All of them. Put them out for us. Pack them up for us." End quote. Detainee witness 919 also describes how Abd-Al-Rahman started calling out the names of individual community leaders. This included Umda Yahya Ahmad Zaruk, Umda Isa Harun Noor, and Umda Adam Hussein Abdul Mahmoud. P877 describes how as they walked out, Abd-Al-Rahman hit them with his axe around their head, neck, and shoulder. And indeed, he went to great lengths to humiliate the detainees, as mentioned by the prosecutor this morning. How Umda Yahya Zaruk's name was called, at which point Ali Kushayb struck him on the head with an axe, and when the Umda could not stand, Ali Kushayb pulled at his ears and said, "I am going to ride the donkey." Under the supervision of Abd-Al-Rahman, his co-perpetrators piled the prisoners into cars like sacks, ordered them to lie down, face down, and some detainees were indeed blindfolded. He then distributed his men amongst the various Land Cruiser vehicles and then walked towards the convoy, shouting, I quote, "Tora Boro is over. Prepare their graves," end quote. This process of loading these detainees to be taken out for execution was seen by no less than 15 prosecution witnesses whose evidence will be laid before you, orally or otherwise. Any vehicles that were fully loaded with detainees left Mukja police station, followed by others soon after. So as you can see in this image, Abd-Al-Rahman, Sami, Hamdi, and others packed the detainees into vehicles next to this police station, the Mukja police station. And if you view this video image, you can see that the convoy traveled northwards along the Garcilla-Mukja road, passing to their left the location where in the future a UNAMID base would be built, passing again a few riverbeds to finally arrive at a particular location where a riverbed intersected with the Mukja-Garcilla road. Next to, as you can see in the satellite image, a number of sycamore trees. We have footage of the actual location taken some years later. My apologies. There we are. My apologies, Your Honor. So as you can see, in this we have footage of the location where the Mukja-Garcilla road intersected at that particular riverbed. And where this intersection occurred, at least 6 prosecution witnesses say that there was an execution involving a number of community leaders. One witness says, I quote, I saw the Umdas as they were being unloaded from the first vehicle. I saw Ali Kusheb use his axe and Aldaif Samih use a Kalashnikov whip and stick to hit the prisoners as they came out of the vehicle. Another witness, P905, describes what Abd-Al-Rahman did next. He's standing like this. He has a stick about 1 meter. Around him are his guards with their weapons. He says to them, bullet them, bullet them. The witness explains, bullet them means kill them. He continues, make sure, don't leave me one person alive, end quote. The witness continues to describe Abd-Al-Rahman's orders. He's saying, immediately, come down, come down, come down. Shoot, shoot, shoot. Immediately, shoot immediately. Repeat for these people. Maybe there are some that you have missed. Repeat for these people. The witness explains what he means by repeat. When you are shooting someone, tuck, 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 then you come again and you do the same thing. This is repetition. End quote. Another witness, I apologize, the same witness, P905, confirms Abd-Al-Rahman's central role during the course of the executions. He says, I quote, nobody talks. Only Ali Kusheb talks. The instructions are from him, end quote. Importantly, other witnesses confirm that the persons who shot and killed these persons at this location, including the community leaders, were either subordinates of Abd-Al-Rahman or close associates of Abd-Al-Rahman. At this point, when a number of detainees had already been shot and killed, the head of the Mukja police force arrives in his jeep. He has heard the shooting. He tells Mr. Abd-Al-Rahman that he handed over the detainees under the condition that they were taken to Garcila and Zelenge. He did not hand them over to be killed. The head of police tried to indeed negotiate with Abd-Al-Rahman that at least some detainees not be killed. The accused did not respond and merely said, let's go. As a result, the convoy traveled a very short distance away from the first execution site, just until Mukja town was out of sight, and then halted. some witnesses say, one large wadi or river, and then arrived at another location near the burnt-out village of Nearly. Nearly, as I mentioned earlier, was attacked by Abd-Al-Rahman's forces before the events in Mukja. And then they finally stopped in this location. We do have some footage of the actual site itself, taken some years later. Here too, just like before, Abd-Al-Rahman ordered, I quote, unload them, after which the detainees were told to get out of the vehicles and lie down rather neatly on the ground. As the detainees were lying next to each other in lines, witness 905, I apologize, a different witness explains, I quote, suddenly they opened fire. There was continuous shooting for a while. They were spraying with every type of gun they had. They reversed their cars, turned their dushkas, that is to say heavy machine guns, and fired them. A witness describes the consequences of this shooting. He says, I quote, I saw Abakar Yahya, that is to say one detainee, was alive, but had been badly injured. He tried to get up, but could not. His waist was broken, and his chest was full of blood. I believe he died soon afterwards. Regarding another detainee, a witness states, Baharuddin Idris was shot. He got up and started running. They shot him again. Members of the militia and Janjaweed and Government of Sudan forces walked on top of the dead bodies to make sure they were dead. One soldier called them slaves, referring to a victim, and took some money from the body of the dead victim. Having heard the gunfire and seen the vehicles of the convoy return empty, the residents of Mukcha deduced what had just occurred. Some days after the killings, they ventured out to search for the bodies. At a valley or dry riverbed near Mukja police station, just north of the UNAMID base that I mentioned already, they discovered some bodies. In fact, witness P877 drew a sketch of that location. And you can see the sketch, when compared with the satellite image, shows the same relationship of the Mukja-Garsila road and the riverbed cutting across. The sketch also corresponds further to what the witness had drawn. The witness recalled that there was a smell of decaying corpses, that many corpses had been discovered. And indeed, the corpses are indicated in this image by a black square. And if we can isolate that black square, the witness identified or recognized the bodies of particular individual victims. He recognized, if we can, one click more please, yes. Umda Yahya Ahmad Zaruk, Umda Adam Hussein Abdul Mahmud, Adam Nahid Numan, and Abdul Khalik Yahya Ishaq Musa, all of whom you have heard of before, and all of whom had been detained with witness P877 in prison when they were detained together. Heartbreakingly, Abdul Khalik, the first student that I mentioned, was discovered by his own father. When the residents of Mukja, including some of our witnesses, traveled further north to Nearly, bodies were found at another execution site, the second execution site that I mentioned. Here too, a witness drew a sketch of that location, and here too you can see with careful study some parallels between the sketch and the satellite image. Here too, witnesses found bodies stacked together, used cartridges, and in fact, the victim who had tried to run during the execution, detainee Baharuddin Idris, was found in this location and identified and buried. Thus, Your Honors, ended the lives of 122 detainees. There were civilians, community leaders, doctors, policemen, farmers, students, children. One of the sources we used to compile this list was drawn by a witness who had been detained at that police station, who had written the names of his fellow detainees on his sleeve in the dark. He explains, "I did this as I believed many of us would be killed, and I wanted to make a record of those who had died, so one day people would know what had happened." Your Honors, as I conclude, I would like to remind you that this duty to make sure that these persons are not faceless, nameless, or forgotten cannot be borne by the fragile shoulders of just one witness, one detainee. It must be borne by us in this courtroom, and it must in particular be borne by this court. Thank you, Honors. I will end my submissions at this point.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes. As I indicated at the end, just before the luncheon adjournment, we'll adjourn the opening here and deal with what I think is being called some housekeeping matters. So for the purposes of the public, I don't think there's any reason to go into private session over any of them. But the parties, I think, have been notified of the matters that I want to discuss. Briefly, first of all, the defence have sought written leave to appeal the number of hours allocated to them for cross-examination during the prosecution case. The trial chamber indicated through the legal officers that there was no necessity for the prosecution to respond, or indeed the legal representative of victims. However, it was brought to bear upon me that I ought to see whether they wished to respond. So, Mr. Nichols, does the prosecution wish to respond?
No, thank you. We'll stay out of that one, Your Honor.
All right. And I'm assuming that the legal representative of victims don't have a dog in this game either.
Yes, Madam President, I'll do you this favor.
Yes, we will give an oral ruling at the conclusion of tomorrow's proceedings. So again, wherever we get to, then we'll do that. Now, the next matter, which is slightly longer, and Mr. Edwards, I think you've been dealing with this aspect of matters. At the last status conference, we discussed, and that was, sorry, just let me get the date, that was on the 23rd of March. We discussed the, as it were, the addition to the pre-trial brief, or the, I think it's more the explanation of paragraph 27 of the pre-trial brief, and really the relevant parts start at page 49 of the transcript from that status conference. And what we indicated, and what the trial chamber couldn't have been clearer about, was that we wanted to deal with the general principle of whether the prosecution could be allowed to call evidence which it had obtained after the confirmation hearing. In other words, May of 2021. And this was in order to stop unnecessary filings, whether formal filings or by way of email, to the legal officers in respect of witnesses to whom the defence objected on the grounds that the evidence was obtained after what they considered to be the cut-off date. And the prosecution was ordered to respond to this by, I think, tomorrow or the day after. I can't remember which.
7 April, Your Honor.
7th of April, thank you. Instead of which, what we have had from the defence is two separate filings, one in relation to witness 903 and one in relation to witness 900 and 990, which repeat the identical submissions, to be precise. Paragraph 11 of the submission 9 for witness P0903 is repeated at paragraph 6 of the next, in identical terms. Mr. Edwards, the whole point was that we don't have this repetitious type of filing, and that we could look at the general principles, decide on the general principles, and then, if there were matters which arose for any of the up-and-coming witnesses, which were unique to those witnesses, if you like, then we would, obviously, you could file something. But the general principle which you're making, that the prosecution should be prevented from calling any evidence like this, is something we wish to decide. Now, do I understand that you didn't understand that?
No, that's not right, Your Honour. We understood what you wanted.
You just weren't prepared to give it.
Well, with respect, I think we did. The filing relating to witness 0903, I think we had made, in the last status conference, if I recall correctly, one or other of us was reminded that there was a witness who was in the first tranche of those in the list about to testify, 903. And so our thinking was that we had already made the submissions of principle in a document called, in French, the clarification.
Yes. Which is what I referred to. That's
Yes.
how this all started off.
That's right.
And I asked you, sorry, Mr. Rose, I'm
Yes.
sorry to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. And then I asked you whether you wanted to add to it, because we wanted to deal with it as a matter of general principle.
Well, yes. Our position has always been, and we say that that position is supported by well-established case law now, which is set out in the filing, that it is not the correct approach, with great respect, to deal with this particular question merely as a matter of principle. It can only properly be dealt with by looking at a particular witness or a particular piece of evidence or a particular class of evidence on a case-by-case basis. Your Honour will recall, in fact, that during the last status conference, you made a comment to my learned leader in these terms. What at the moment I'm at a loss to understand is why you say there's any cut-off date. The purpose of this document, this filing, 903, was specifically to address your Honour's question and to explain precisely why we say that there is a cut-off date, that as a matter of principle, there can be a cut-off date. But in order to apply the principle to any particular piece of evidence in relation to any particular witness, the context of how that witness came to have his or her evidence collected after what we call is the cut-off date, i.e. the confirmation of charges hearing, that must be looked at on its own merits. And so this filing of 1st of April was specifically to address Your Honour's comment to my learned friend, to revisit the well-established case law and then to apply that principle to a concrete example, that concrete example being 903, that we raised in the last status conference as being a forthcoming witness, in order, we thought, to assist the trial chamber in, well, in order to assist, we hoped the trial chamber to see things through our eyes.
Yes, but, sorry, first of all, Mr. Edwards, you're absolutely right. That was the comment I made.
Yeah.
And what I was expecting was, and what we were expecting, was that you would be addressing in your next filing that general principle, which you do to a certain extent, although you rely on the case of Guichero, the very recent judgment, but you've taken the quote right out of context of all of this, and it was a completely different set of situations from that apply in this case, nor does the ruling purport to set out any kind of standard. So what I am trying to avoid is repetitive filings, which, as we've already seen, you say in the case of P903 at paragraph 11, the prosecution has been willing and able to conduct its investigations in the Sudan since the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding between the OTP, etc., etc. And you say the identical thing at paragraph 6 of the filing in respect of witness 990. Do you see, people have to plough through these.
Yes.
And if this is dealt with, if we came to the conclusion that as a matter of principle and law as applied in this tribunal, there is no such thing as a cut-off date, then what you have to look at is the circumstances which are specific to a witness, which if they're no more than it was taken after that particular date, doesn't take you anywhere. Is that clear, Mr. Edwards?
Well, it's clear what it is that you would like in the future, yes. So what I can say is that in the future, we absolutely take on board Your Honour's comments and concerns, and we will make more use of the formula of, incorporating by reference. But Your Honour's point is exactly what we wish to address. We say that these applications can only be dealt with on their own merits, on a case-by-case basis.
I understand. There are two, Mr. Edwards, I don't think I'm getting it across to you. I perfectly accept that for each witness to which you take objection, there may be specific circumstances which take it out of the normal run. But if the only circumstance is that the prosecution took the witness statement after May the 21st, after May 2021, and we decide, and can I emphasize, we have come to no decision yet at all about this, we decide that really no such cut-off point is available to the defense because it doesn't in law exist at this tribunal. The law, let us say for the sake of argument, is that the prosecution can carry on investigating. It then becomes, as you say rightly, a matter for the circumstances in which each individual witness statement was taken.
Yes, absolutely. And I feel that we do have to defend ourselves. That is precisely what we have done in the last two filings. There may have been a degree of repetitive leading in to the particular submissions about these particular witnesses. But once we then move into the case-by-case approach, it's my submission that each of these motions does deal with the particular circumstances of how each of these witnesses came to give their evidence to the prosecution, or perhaps more correctly, how the prosecution came to collect the evidence of each of these witnesses. And our attempt in these two filings is to suggest that the way in which the evidence was collected from the prosecution discloses a certain lack of diligence on the prosecution's part.
Yes, all right. But it may not be the exact same words, but it's very much the same argument in respect of both 903 and 990. Isn't it? It's effectively that the prosecution should have taken it before May 2021. And I'm right, aren't I, in thinking, Mr. Rhodes, sorry, just on one other matter, the other difference between these witnesses and that in Guichero is that all of these witnesses were disclosed to you, even though they may not have appeared on the prosecution's witness list to be called. Or, in fact, they may have been on that.
I'd have to go back to check my notes on this. I think there's certainly one witness. I may be thinking about a different witness whose evidence is in the form of audio recordings, which were only the Arabic versions of which have been disclosed to us, the English translations of which have not yet been disclosed to us. That may in fact be, I think that in fact is a filing I'm working on at the moment, which I hope will be with Your Honours in the next day or so. But I think our argument is that whether they were disclosed to us or not, the lack of diligence on the part of the prosecution in obtaining these witness statements long ago, when they ought to have done, militates in favour of their exclusion.
Well, that's we're going round in circles now, because that's the reason why I asked whether you wanted to make any further submissions on the actual general principle of what you really are arguing, which is if they hadn't got their act together by May 2021, then they should be precluded from calling the evidence. That's what it amounts to, isn't it?
Yeah, and as far as those arguments of principle, we have said all that we wish to say.
Yeah, right. All right. Well, that's all I wanted to know. Thank you very much, Mr. Edwards. Mr. Nichols, I take it there's nothing you want to...
Well,
there is something you want to say.
just very briefly, I can't help myself, Your Honor. I mean, I think you were very clear. I've been listening to my friend. None of this, their objections make sense unless you do tie it to that general principle. 903 was disclosed over 6 months ago, before trial. There is zero prejudice, and so we will respond on the 7th when we have our time. But unless you tie it back to that principle, they're lost. They are making this diligence argument using the cornerstone of the confirmation hearing. So we will respond in writing, but I just had to say something.
Yes, right. Well, I raised it simply because, as I say, it seemed to me that the arguments were addressed to specific witnesses and not dealing with what I was looking for, what we were looking for. Yes. All right, thank you all very much. We'll resume again tomorrow morning with the prosecution opening at 9:30, and as I say, we'll give a ruling. Oh, sorry, Mr. Edwards, do you want to add something, do you?
Was there anything Your Honours wanted to say about Regulation 35 applications?
Not that I'm aware of. Was I going to say something about...
It was on the agenda, as it were.
Oh, right. I'm not sure what it was. If I think of it tomorrow morning, Mr. Edwards, I'll mention it tomorrow morning. Yes. Yes, very well. So 9:30 tomorrow morning, we'll resume the opening. And the first witness is then the expert, Mr. Nichols, is that right?
Correct, and I think we probably have less than an hour to conclude the opening statement.
Well, then we'll probably Well, if it's less than an hour,
It'll probably be fairly,
is the,
guys help me. It'll be a little bit under an hour.
Right.
And then there are some other matters, so it may work out best to call the witness at the start of the second session.
yeah.
is
Well,
my
that's what I'm
guess.
just wondering. But not if I think it makes it difficult if we alter the breaks completely. So for the staff, but I'm just wondering whether you needed to do anything in particular that so that you needed a break before the witness starts.
No, Your Honor, I do
Right.
not believe so.
Well, then
We
we'll
can
see
just
how
go
it
straight
goes. I
ahead.
mean, if it's something like 11:15, well, then we'll adjourn then and start the witness after the break. All right. Yes, thank you all very much. Thank you.
Madam President, just to remind you that you've allocated us the time tomorrow for just
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
just to remind you that you've allocated a little time to our small opening, and of course to the accused as well.
You are
I mean,
quite- you
I
are
think
quite
all in all,
right.
the first session will do for all of us, but
Yeah, you're absolutely
Don't
right to
forget
remind
about
me.
it.
Thank you very much for honesty. I'd forgotten that. You said you wanted a little time, and that Mr. Al-Rahman wants to make a short statement. Yes. All right. Well, that will certainly take us to the first break.
All rise, veuillez vous lever.